This is Jim Hennager again. Table talk with the New Independent Party. I switched the camera around. Yesterday it was pretty dark. We're still in a weather situation where it's been raining all last night and some today. May continue to rain this afternoon. Right now the wind is coming up and the water has come up in this small lake completely out of its banks within a few feet of my house. So if it continues to rain, we're going to need a big boat, or maybe my house would be a big boat on a lake. We deliberately wanted to live right on the lake here as close as possible. We have. The risks are that sometimes the water comes up. It's supposed to self-regulate on the other end of the lake with a levee, and so far it always has, so I'm not terribly anxious, but it has made for kind of a dark and gloomy day again. So maybe it's appropriate for the topic I'd like to get into today, which is the notion of exceptionalism. It's a big word, esoteric kinds of word. In a theory, it means feeling like you're special. And in history, we've had a number of civilizations who all felt like they were exceptional, that they were special, they had a special place in history. In many cases, they thought they had some god or gods behind them, and as long as they won their war battles, the god was behind them. When they lost, then the god wasn't. But it also had to do with if crops came in or if they didn't come in. The lesson really that I'd like to get to is that exceptionalism is a very false kind of sense of nationalism, and every nation that has ever put itself out as being on the top or number one or most powerful or in any way trying to brag up its being special has fallen. I mean, that's just how it works out, that countries and nations, in fact it happens with anybody that gets too proud. So the saying that false pride goes before a fall is very true of civilizations as well as countries and individuals. I'm afraid that the United States has been on this exceptionalism kick for 50, 60 years, and we're due for a real come down. And I believe that you can see that other countries are working feverishly to have that happen. And we might sit here and say, well, we have the right to remain number one in the world because we have the resources and we have the largest GNP and all kinds of reasons. But we haven't made the best use of our diplomacy or our goodwill or our investments abroad. We have pretty much burned every bridge that you can think of around the world, and going to war time after time with different countries, and in many cases we were the invaders. We've never won one of those wars. You can take Korea and Vietnam and Czechoslovakia and Iraq, Afghanistan. It doesn't appear that we go into wars to win them. We go into wars to spend money, and we spend a lot of money. In fact, a good share of our national debt still is related to the 10, 11, 12-year wars that we were involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're still there. And now we're saying we're getting ready to send more troops back into those countries, and it would appear that we're heading for an economic political collapse here in the United States if we're not careful about these assumptions that that come out in the political debates, you can see these candidates, particularly the Republicans, they're stomping around saying we got to send all kinds of troops to the Middle East to fight ISIS. One candidate has even dropped a hint that we should drop a nuclear bomb on them. Those are very irresponsible kind of statements to make, and they don't do anything but build up the people that would like to see us fall. You just can't invade country after country and not have pushback or resistance to our country. Then, when they do resist, we call them terrorists, which is ironic because I suppose the British troops probably called our American fighters during the American Revolution terrorists as well. So anybody who doesn't agree with your side becomes a terrorist, and we just have a modern form of resistance today in what we've seen in the jihadist movement in Syria, and it would appear that we're going down the same road that every other civilization has gone down, in thinking that we're so super good, so super powerful that we can't fail, we can't go down. But that is not true. There's all kinds of ways that the United States could trip themselves up, and we're probably doing it economically as we speak. I mean, we cannot carry a national debt that's larger than our gross national product for very long before just the interest on that debt starts eating into in a great way into our economy, and it is. The hundreds of billions that we're paying on interest is an effect on our economy. So, where does this exceptionalism come from, and why is it always so prevalent in civilizations just before they go down the tube? Well, there's a period of time in the 500s, from maybe 530 to 590, 600 AD, where we saw the Roman civilization basically come apart. It might be worth just recounting some of what happened there, so you can see some parallels to what the U.S. is, looking at right now. Some of the characters of that time period are very interesting to study, and I recommend anybody that is interested in history or interested in politics or interested in our future to take a look at that time period when the Roman civilization, the Roman Empire, came to an end, which is about 590 something. And the history books say that it came to an end when nomadic Huns from the north came down and invaded Rome, and that was the end of the Roman Empire. But actually it had fallen apart maybe a decade before that. And there were some events that led up to that are reminiscent of what we're experiencing today, and I can see some very interesting parallels. For one, what was going on in the 520, 530, 540 time period was that Rome had hired a mercenary, basically, we've been calling him Attila the Hun, who would go around to tribes and conquer them and add their tribes to his army. And he was going from what's now Hungary through Germany and coming around Europe. And the Romans were actually paying him to defeat some of the outlying northern resistance groups up there. And what he was doing was every time he would conquer one of these tribes, he would basically force them to join his army. And so as he's coming down through France and what is now northern Spain, his army had accumulated to over 600,000 soldiers. So it was a huge army for that time period in history, and the Romans then felt threatened. It was very interesting. It was very parallel to some of the things that we've been doing in the Middle East, where you pay people to do things and then they turn against you. pushback or blowback, as it's called. The same thing was happening there. Attila the Hun was threatening the Roman Empire, and they sent their general Cassius with another 600,000 soldiers to confront him. And that confrontation took place in what is now northern Spain, and Cassius very wisely tricked Attila into a narrow valley. Now his train of soldiers and equipment and people bringing food and all of that stretched out over 20 miles long. So it was a huge caravan that he was involved with. They tricked him into going up to this valley, which the Roman soldiers had about 300,000 longbowmen, and they used a very long arrow, and on the end of it was a metal tip, and that was very destructive to the Attila the Hun, particularly their foot soldiers, because all they had were leather shields and leather helmets. So the metal piercing arrows were deadly, and as that battle ensued, the bowmen were basically firing on them at the bottom of the valley, and it's estimated that it only took about a half an hour, and over 300,000 of Attila's soldiers were killed in that valley. It was just a slaughter. The only ones that were able to get out of it were his horsemen. He had very well-trained, very experienced horsemen. They were able to come up the sides of the valley and just go right down through the bowmen, and within an hour or two they had killed over 300,000 of the Roman bowmen on the top of those hills. So then it was left to the Roman soldier in full armament taking on the remaining army pretty much in the valley there, and that went on for several more hours. But by the end of the day, as darkness came, both sides sent emissaries, and they basically agreed to both pull back and to take care of their wounded and their dead, which would have had to take days to accomplish. But both armies pulled back. It was really pretty much a technical draw. But Cassius came back to Rome as a war hero. He was given parades and all kinds of allocates to his being victorious, even if he really wasn't. On Attila the Hun's side, he came back to the Hungarian area it was his homeland, and even though it wasn't a technical defeat, he took it that it was a very negative thing on his career, and apparently for maybe a decade or two he was in a depressed state, if you don't want to call it that. Then around 550, 560, he got his excitement for war, whatever you call it, back in gear, and put together another 600,000 troops, and their war cry was they were going to take on the Romans and destroy Rome. Well, coming from the north as they were down to Rome, they had to go through a mountain pass where there was a castle fort up there called Aquileia, and this fort had never been taken, as it had been in existence for maybe 1,000 years, and all during the Roman occupation and the Roman Empire it had withstood any kind of assault. So here was Attila with 600,000 men. He was up in the mountains. They encircled the fort, and they wouldn't let anybody go out. They wouldn't let any supplies come in. And they basically went through a winter up there, which was a severe ordeal to Attila's army as well. And by spring, they were down to being very desperate because they were running out of food. They were, killed all of the cattle that they had with them, killing their dogs. They were very close to having to kill their horses, which was a very, important prize to these horsemen. And many people said that their horses were more invaluable to them than their wives. So Attila had to make a decision, and he apparently was ready to call with a retreat when he looked out over Aquileia and he saw some storks flying out of the city. Storks, we think of them as bringing babies, but actually they're scavengers. So he knew that if the scavengers, the storks, were leaving Aquileia, that there couldn't have been much, of anything left in the city. So his army then came down to the valley and actually just came right through the gates. There was no resistance, no fighting, and they came into a city where people were completely decimated. Many of them were sick, starving, no food there, and they took Aquileia. Then they came on down the valley, and they came within about 10 miles of Rome when they were met by a person of history that I'd urge you to look into by the name of Leo. Now, the history books say that at this time it was Pope Leo, but I don't believe he was actually given that title at this time. Leo still, at this meeting, was the last administrator of the Roman Empire. From about 520 to 570 in that time period, Rome was having a lot of problems, and they related to what happened with General Cassius and Attila out in Spain, with 300,000 Roman soldiers dying there. They had an agreement that if a soldier died in battle, that they would give so much money to the families. But they had no money. They were broke, and they weren't able to give this tribute to the families. So there was 300,000 families in and around Rome were very upset with the government because they couldn't provide this tribute to them. So there was a lot of unemployment. There was a lot of conflict in that society. The crops apparently were failing year after year. It appears that the temperature got colder for decades. Crops weren't coming in, so they couldn't get the taxes that they needed. And what the government was doing was chaotic. Sometimes there was many as 3 generals who would all claim to be the emperor of Rome, the Roman Empire, and sometimes there wouldn't be any. And sometimes one would be in there and it'd be assassinated within a month or two. So it was complete chaos. It was a time period where nobody knew what was happening. And out in the outer reaches of the empire, from Great Britain to Spain to France to the Middle East and to Northern Africa, resistance groups were building up. And many of them were threatening to leave the Roman Empire. In all of this, Cassius was actually given a demotion in a sense. He only had a very small army. And here Attila was with 600,000 soldiers 10 miles from a city that had no guards. I mean, there wasn't any army. There wasn't any reason that he could have just walked right into that city and destroyed it. But here was a meeting with the administrator, Leo, in a tent out on a flat area just outside of Rome, and they only met supposedly for 10 minutes. And in that 10 minutes, something was exchanged, and Attila came out of that tent and ordered his soldiers to go back home. Now, history has it that Attila was upset because he was promised some princes from the Istanbul, the Eastern Orthodox area, and they weren't going to give him that princess. So he was upset and he brought his troops back. But that is ridiculous. I mean, Attila the Hun had over 600 wives. Every tribe that he took over, every region that he conquered, he would marry some princess from that area, and all of those princesses lived, under his control. So he wasn't lacking for any wives. I just don't believe that was an accurate description. However, I think if you get into some of the social political kinds of things that were going on right then, particularly with Leo, you could come to another conclusion, and that conclusion has to do with Leo was about the same age, just a few years difference than Attila was. And during this time period, particularly the last 100 years or so of the Roman Empire, they had developed a program which is, very similar to our international student exchange program, where Rome would invite the 12-year-old son of a prominent person that they had, identified out in their kingdom. They would invite this 12-year-old to come to Rome with the idea that they would basically soften them up. They lived with the senators' families. They, partied with them. They were involved in schooling. What they wanted them to do was like the Roman culture, and when they went back home at 18, they would be basically a spokesperson for the Roman Empire. And to a certain extent that helped them out over the years, because you had that exchange of culture and exchange of ideas, very similar to what we have with our international programs, and in our inviting international students from around the world. It does have a benefit. The other side of that was that the senator would send his 12-year-old son to their camp or to their tribe, and his purpose was clearly to be a spy. He wanted the son to gather all kinds of information, get him embroiled in the culture so that they knew more about their so-called enemies out there. And the interesting thing here is that Acacius, who later became General Acacius, was one of those exchange students, if you'd call it that. He actually went to live with Attila the Hun's father's family. At the same time, Attila, who wasn't Attila the Hun at that time, but Attila came to Rome as a 12-year-old and lived with a Roman family. Now, you have to appreciate that Leo and Attila probably crossed paths. I think Leo was a couple years older than Attila, but there's not a lot of records here. But from what we do know, Attila hated being in Rome, and it would appear that he would be gone, he'd be absent for long periods of time where they couldn't find him. It was too far to make it back to the Hungarian area. So he was sort of trapped in this situation, and he hated it. Hated it so much that it was burned in him from that experiences from age 12 to 18 that he wanted to come back and destroy the Rome and the Roman culture. And it came out in how he fought his wars. He was a very powerful individual, but he'd have his soldiers burn scars into their faces, and they would wear these leather helmets to make them look super masculine, super scary. But he also had an ethic that very few invading armies don't get involved in sexual misconduct and rape and those kind of things. But he had a rule that if any of his soldiers were caught raping somebody, that they would be killed on the spot. So it was a very unusual mix of psychology going on here from his experiences in Rome. Now, there's something else that I believe has to come out, and it might come out, but in the Roman culture, and Leo was not a senator's son, but he was a member of the aristocracy. He was a member of a very wealthy family. They were business-orientated people, and you can verify this in a number of diaries from senators at that time. They actually believed in their culture that the Roman senator was exceptional. They were special. They could do things that other people couldn't do. And one of the things that they did was they had sex with these 12-year-old boys. Now that in itself is, in our way of looking at a deplorable kind of situation. But you can find diaries from that time where Roman senators would say that they were married, they enjoyed their relationships with their wives, but the highest form of sexual relationship was with a young boy. And this was part of their culture. So, if you put these things together, and I'm always encouraging my students to be able to connect the dots. And if you connect the dots, you would have found that in this 10 minutes, in this tent outside of Rome with Attila having 600,000 soldiers, something had to have been said there that was very emotional, dramatic, and would have embarrassed Attila to the point where he would withdraw. The only thing that could have come out of that was that Leo knew what sexual kind of experiences Attila must have gone through because of this culture of having sex with young boys. That would have caused the kind of socialization patterns that we see that came out of Attila throughout his life. And I think that's a point of history that we need to kind of look seriously at, because within about 10 years time period there, Leo became Pope Leo. He became head of the Roman Catholic Church. So here you had administrative Leo. He had a connection to Attila the Hun, and it had to go on back to when they were 12 to 18 years old. It had to have had something to do with sexual misconduct. And then he becomes Pope Leo. Now, there's some things that happened right during that time, because Pope Leo was one of the organizers of the New Testament. He was putting together this Christian religion right in front of him during that time. There was a council there that was picking out the books of the Bible, and Pope Leo personally brought three ideas forward that came into the New Testament. And the first one was that there was a triune God. Before that, there weren't any kind of philosophies there that ascribed to this idea that there was a God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. But he brought that forward and got it accepted. Now, it was accepted because God the Holy Spirit was the Catholic Church. And so they felt that the body of the church was equal to being a God. And that played out even to this day, because 1,000 years later, the King of England was cutting off the heads of people, including Sir Thomas More, who might have denied that they believed in the triune God. So this concept came forward, and it was based in exceptionalism to the hilt. You can just sit back and kind of look at it. But the second one was even more so, and that was the infallibility of the Pope. So here you had the church being considered a god itself, and then you have the Pope, the head of this church, being infallible. In fact, he's like he had a red phone to God. He could translate for God. He could give messages for God. He could give edicts, and they were accepted as the same as coming from God. The third thing that he did, which was significant, was that he brought into the New Testament the idea of tithing. If you give 10%, then you were basically buying your way into heaven. And that has stayed with the Catholic Church ever since. It's been a huge economic factor. So if you stand back and look at what happened there, Leo went from the last administrator of the Roman Empire to Pope Leo, the head of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, within a decade. And you have to believe that some of the culture from that Roman time came into the early church. You have to see it in the kind of buildings that they were building, the cathedrals. You could see it in the way that the priest and the cardinals dressed. So here was a new religion that was speaking to the poorest of people, but they were demonstrating themselves to be superior. I don't know how else you can put it. They were exceptional. They were special. And even to this day, you can see it in how they dress and how their ceremonies go. This idea of exceptionalism was paramount to the Catholic Church. You can see it, 1,000 years later with Galileo, an astronomer who, has his small telescope on a table, and he shows that we're not the center of the world, the universe. In fact, we're going around the sun. Prior to that, the Catholic assumption was that we were the center of the universe, and it was because we were special to God. God made us special. He created us on a Saturday afternoon, so to speak. And that is the very nature of creationism, that we're special, we're created in God's image, we're special to God, and it carried over to the idea that we were the only life form in the universe. We were that special. Now, as years developed, particularly in the last 50 years, last 100 years from Darwinism coming into, making evolution a science, what we've done is we just moved that exceptionalism of creation to exceptionalism of evolution. We now say that humans are the only intelligent life form in the universe. Everybody else is microbiotic, and maybe that's how life came here during evolution. It came on a meteor or comet, and it landed in some mud, and it took millions of years, and over the millions of years it developed into 1.4 million species. Well, if you do the math, that's impossible. That whole thing is a bunch of malarkey. I'm sorry to the scientists who believe in it, but it's a bunch of malarkey. There has to be other explanations, and it just fits into this exceptionalism idea that man is still, very important. He's the highest form of intelligence in the universe. I'll get into that in another session, because I think we're not going to move to another level of civilization until we, make a correction in how we believe about that. And I think we're due to have a correction in this idea of exceptionalism. Until we can get over ourselves, I don't see how we can grow as individuals or as a civilization. We have to come to some realization that we're all in this together. And on Earth, if we don't cooperate and work together, we could destroy ourselves. That seems very possible. And particularly now, today, when we have so many weapons of destruction, that if we were to get into a third world war, who would know how it would come out? It's absolutely insane that we would consider using nuclear war or nuclear weapons in the Middle East against ISIS. That I'm sorry, but whoever says that is, they should be run away from right away. Okay, so we have this idea of exceptionalism. It's grounded in every civilization. It certainly was grounded in Pope Leo's ideas of the church. It became the center post of the Catholic theology, and they defended it. I mean, anybody that tried to argue against it was the enemy. And one of those examples is seen in what happened in Alexandria. Now, Pope Leo had a close friend and a Senator Diaz. And Senator Diaz's brother was the head of the Roman libraries. There was 3 main libraries at that time, and one was in Rome, which ended up as the library of the Roman Catholic Church, and is still there today. It's locked up. You can't go in there. But there's maybe millions of manuscripts in that library. Another library was at Istanbul, which is now was then Constantinople. Now it's Istanbul, and that ended up being sort of the background, the structure for the Eastern Orthodox Church. And then the third one was at Alexandria. Now, something that the Roman Empire did from the very beginning, whenever they conquered someplace, they would gather up all of the artifacts and manuscripts, and they would send them to one of these museums, which were really not just libraries, but they were actual museums of all these artifacts. Well, the one at Alexander basically brought in all of the material from the Middle East and Northern Africa. And as we got into 580, 590 time period, there was a group of independent scholars. Now, I've mentioned before that during this time period there weren't a lot of people that could read or write, but there were centers of scholarly activity. Most of that scholarly activity was either funded or sponsored by either the Roman government or religious groups. And so you had that same kind of attitude towards what was developing in Alexandria, because here were a group of independent scholars, and that huge library was there, and they were forming a learning center or a university around a number of very prominent scholars, one of whom was a woman who may have discovered the first mechanical computer. We're still finding some of these small mechanical devices in shipwrecks just in the last year or two. What this group in Alexander was saying was that they had evidence that the Christian church was fabricated. It was not what it was, being told was, and that in fact a group of Greek scholars had come down to Alexander libraries about 150 A.D. and had put together what became known as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those first 4 books. Now, a lot of Christians today think that the disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were the ones that wrote those, but actually that's not true. They were written by Greek scholars or Greek writers who were probably paid, and they came down to Alexandria to pick up on themes or scripts to put into that New Testament. So that could not be not challenged by Pope Leo. So he sent down a bishop and apparently a group of people from Rome who, they might have been soldier type people. Maybe it was the Knights of Malta or maybe it was the Jesuits, but they went down there and their mission was to destroy the library, which they burned it down, and they also killed almost all of those scholars, including that woman who they drug out on the street and beat her to death. So here you have the first examples of the Holy Roman Catholic Church defending its theology by basically killing people and burning libraries and information that might go counter to it. So it's very interesting that for the next 1,000 years or so we saw reformations and we saw inquisitions, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people died because the Holy Roman Catholic theology had to be defended, and it was because of exceptionalism. They were the special people. They were the right hand of God, so to speak, and it came down through from Pope to cardinals to bishops to priests, to the point where a lot of the priests felt like they were godly. They were speaking for God. They ran their church in that way, and even as pious and as humble as they might have appeared in the public, in private they developed some of the same cultural patterns that go all the way back to the Romans, and that's why we're seeing the problems we are today. I mean, you can't have it's not just 1 or 2 priests that are involved in the sexual misconduct with 12-year-old altar boys. It's thousands. And it's not fair to say that all priests are bad if they're involved in this. But there's some estimates and studies that have shown that maybe 30% of all priests get into the priesthood and they have homosexual kind of tendencies. So as you build up this, connecting the dots, you have a culture within the Catholic Church of male dominance and feeling exceptional and special, and that's how they would basically seduce young boys. They did it hundreds of years ago, they do it today. And I think we need to take a serious look at what that means. I mean, is that a culture that we want to, bring forward? I think only several of these priests have been sent to prison, have been arrested, but there's hundreds and hundreds of complaints in countries all over the world. So why is that? Why aren't they being persecuted? Why aren't they being prosecuted? Why hasn't the church, really gone strong and declaring that they have a problem? And in fact, they're saying they do on the surface, but underneath, they're still covering these things up. And right here in Iowa, we have cases where priests have been, shoved to another small church so that they don't get arrested, and those kinds of misconduct is still going on. So you see what I'm trying to say here is that this concept of exceptionalism, of feeling like you're special, of thinking that you're above everybody else, whether you're an individual or a country or a nation or a civilization, will get you into trouble. And at some point, it's going to be your downfall. False pride comes just before the fall. And I think we have to be very careful here in the United States that we realize that we're not number one, we're not that special, we've screwed up. We need to move in new directions if we're going to be real leaders for the future. And it can't be by guns and war. It's got to be by partnership and working with people and recognizing that everybody on this planet is equal or has the right to be equal, have opportunities. And we're not doing that. America is so far off of this idea that it's just sad. And our politicians are sad because they're caught up in it, and they call it nationalism, but there's a link between exceptionalism, nationalism, and fascism, and I'm afraid that that's the direction we're heading, that sooner or later we move from being nationalistic and proud of our country to a few saying that they're special, extra special, and they have the right to control and govern and dominate even our own citizens. And I see parts of that already developing. We see it in large corporations. We're seeing it in special interest groups having dominant kinds of influence on our congressmen. It's inevitable that that's the direction it goes unless we turn it around. There's no reason that we can't accept that we're a part of this earth, civilization, and work together. We could be a very well-respected leader in the world if we would simply to change how we do business in the world. So I hope that I haven't upset a lot of people. I may get into some of these things a little bit deeper. I would look into Attila the Hun and Pope Leo if you have a chance, because there are some turning points in history, and that 100-year time period is very interesting, how it's influencing us today. Okay, so again, take care and stay warm. Thank you.